Hello and welcome to the Arise interview, 60 glorious minutes of multifaceted discussion where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things, and we feature the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Anyegolu. Coming up in the next hour, controversial governorship elections in Kogi and Bayelsa states. They were predictable, and in Kogi state, amid widespread attacks, kidnappings, killings and disruptions, it's gone as predicted. Catastrophically wrong, according to many there. We'll speak to those who say that Nigeria's electoral process has lost all credibility and that this country's democracy is facing its greatest threat ever in the wake of these latest elections. And later, after that flawed voting in Kogi and Bayelsa and looking ahead to the 2023 presidential poll, it's never been more important to start now to work towards a significant and fundamental reform of Nigeria's voting process. And today, a major conference taking place in Abuja has been doing just that, calling for a digitalized electoral system where voting is safe and secure and votes will count in 2023. We'll dip into that conference and speak to the organizers of the Digital Voting Summit in a moment. So, after numerous allegations of irregularities, violence, shootings, killings, ballot box snatching, and intimidation of voters, the governorship election results have been announced in Kogi and Bayelsa. In Kogi State, in north-central Nigeria, Governor Yahaya Bello has retained control of State House with a sizable margin of victory, according to the Independent National Electoral Commission, INEC. But the results have been hotly disputed by many, including civil society organizations and opposition parties who are calling for the election to be cancelled. In Bayelsa State, in the Niger Delta, David Lyon, the governorship candidate for President Buhari's party, the APC, has won the ballot in 6 out of the 8 local governments in the state, defeating the rival PDP, which has been in power in the state since Nigeria returned to democracy in 1999. But the PDP has rejected the outcome. In both Kogi and Bayelsa, the political temperature remains exceedingly high, and the losers will almost certainly be heading for the election tribunals. Take a look at some video evidence of the sort of violence that erupted during these elections and the assessment of some observers.
Situation report in electoral, there are some set of guys who have come around to scatter our ballots. Guys, this is what they do. These are people from Fiayabi. Can you see them?
Situation Room received reports of late commencement of polls in several polling units across the 2 states of Kogi and Bayelsa. INEC raised concern that the security services attached to support the elections did not provide backup to enable some of the staff start out at the stipulated time, and this caused several of the delays. It is noteworthy, though, that in several of the cases where polls commenced late, INEC guidelines provided for polling to continue until everyone on the queue voted. Logistics. There are also few reports of polling materials and personnel not arriving on time. INEC again put the responsibility for these failings on the security services, who did not report on time or failed to provide security for transportation of election materials to their destinations. Use of smart card readers. The election saw improved use of smart card readers. Situation Room observed that smart card readers were widely deployed and utilized in both states. There were, however, isolated cases of card reader malfunctions. In most of these instances, these were rectified in line with INEC guidelines. In other cases, there was a resort to manual accreditation. In Bayelsa, this was observed in some polling units, and this is listed in the report that you will receive. Voter turnout. Situation Room's impression of voter turnout in the two governorship elections is that of enthusiasm. Voters were not deterred by pre-election day anxiety, threats of violence, and turned out in their numbers. Election day turnout was, however, marred by violence and activities of political parties and security agents, leading to the disruption of polls in several areas.
Clement Wankwo there. Well, for more on the Kogi and Bayelsa governorship elections in Nigeria, I'm joined now by the man himself in the studio, the human rights and constitutional lawyer and convener of the Civil Society Situation Room, a coalition of 400 civil society organizations that monitor elections in Nigeria, Clement Wankwo. Thank you very much indeed for coming in. Busy day for you, no doubt.
Busy, yes, last couple of days, indeed last couple of weeks, keeping up with the pre-election issues, and then over the weekend the voting that took place and the information and observation reports that were coming in from both Kogi and Bayelsa.
We're very grateful to you for making out the time to talk to us. In terms of these governorship elections in Kogi and Bayelsa that you monitored closely, probably better than any other organization in this country, is it fair to say that they are totally unfair and not free? Fundamental freedoms were disregarded and the integrity of the election process was not safeguarded, which is what some opposition members are suggesting?
Well, we did our report and we had observers throughout the two states. They were there before the elections. We've been monitoring development in the two states. The two elections were fundamentally flawed. With Kogi State, we have actually called for outright cancellation of that election because it wasn't an election. Basically, there was a war that went on in Kogi State, a situation where voters were killed, people were killed. We received reports of parents going out to vote, coming back as dead bodies. The children were crying, the wives were crying. It's an incredible situation for this country that you would have voters go out and you would have armed police and security personnel shooting even to kill. You would have armed thugs of political parties shooting and killing voters who turn out to vote. Yes, there are complaints with Nigeria's electoral process, and we saw a lot of those complaints in the 2019 general elections that held in March this year. But this is unprecedented. This is never seen before in Nigeria. And this is a major, major threat to our democracy.
Well, let's just get the figures that you have out of the way. What sort of numbers of dead are we talking about in a state like Kogi State?
That's still been compiled, but there are several reports that we have seen. We do have a member of the Situation Room putting that figure together at this time, but there are several deaths that we have received, or death reports that we have received. We don't have a full compilation yet, and we will yet make those compilations public. But certainly everyone who was on the field, every observer who was on the field, and this is the first time you would have observers themselves being targeted by political parties, by security agents. We have reports of several Situation Room members, other observers, even international observers being brutalized by security agents, by the thugs of political parties in this election. What took place in Kogi State, what took place in Bayelsa to a lesser extent, but in Kogi especially, was not an election.
So I mean a sort of free-for-all, really, and a free-for-all that benefited those who had guns.
Yes, what we saw was a lot of thugs being armed, a lot of instances where security agents turned the other way when that should not be the case. This was also the election that we saw the highest deployment, state elections, that the police announced the highest deployment of security personnel. 34,000 in Kogi State, 31,000 in Bayelsa State, and yet That was not evident on the field, and yet people were killed, and yet disruptions took place in such incredible proportions.
Well, to be honest, Clement, I can't remember the number of times that I have sat with you in interview, and your analysis always very credible to both people in Nigeria and internationally. But I can't remember the number of times now that we have sat and discussed exactly the same thing. What you're saying is that it is even worse this time. And I'm just wondering whether Nigeria has now entered a dangerous stage where elections have essentially become a mere formality. It's not really an election that is there to, take count of people's votes. It's just a mere formality, and the votes are decided in a completely different way.
Elections are supposed to provide a basis for citizens measuring what their leaders have done, deciding whether to vote them back to power or to vote a new set in. And increasingly, we have seen that this is becoming less about the people and much more about those who can afford the guns, those who can afford to manipulate the institutions of state, those who can afford to manipulate the electoral process. We're not interested in the results. It doesn't matter for us as observers who wins the election. The process is the key thing, and the process we have seen with Kogi, with Bayelsa, is not a process that we can recommend to anybody, any electoral process outside of this country. It's indeed, what we have seen is indeed a shame, and we all are ashamed about what has happened with these two recent elections.
And of course, there is what's happened in the election during the process, and then there is the aftermath. Do you think anyone will be held to account for these atrocities, for this weaponization, as somebody put it, of the electoral process in Nigeria?
We didn't see anybody yet held to account with respect to the 2019 general elections, which we as Situation described as lacking credibility. We saw again the use of arms in Bayelsa, in Rivers State, across Nigeria, and nobody to date has been brought to account. Nobody has been charged to court. There is no political will to ensure that elections are conducted properly in this country. The fear, of course, is going towards 2023, which is the next general elections, that what politicians will be preparing for would be war of a great magnitude.
But I mean, are there legal procedures? I mean, you're calling for the cancellation of the elections, is that right, in Kogi State?
Yes.
Are there legal procedures for cancelling elections which the Independent Electoral Commission is bound by, and unless those procedures kick in, INEC can't really cancel the elections?
INEC should not have announced the results of that election. Certainly, if you are conducting elections and the circumstances are not right, and we've said this repeatedly, INEC cannot abandon its process to the elements. Where you see as an electoral commission that your conduct of election is being hindered by violence, it's been hindered by interference, but it's been hindered by the activities of other stakeholders, especially political parties, then you must take action. And the question for all of us is, what is INEC counting? What did they count? What results did they present to the public? On what basis would INEC say, in all honesty, that what it has read out as the results of the elections in particularly Kogi State is the results of an election? Well,
I have to say this is enormously disheartening, but Clement Nwankwo, I know you've got a lot of things to do, so I must let you run. Thank you very much indeed. Clement Nwankwo is the human rights and constitutional lawyer and convener of the Civil Society Situation Room that monitored these elections.